we're looking at the key to the future, that God provides His presence and tells them really how to benefit from it, how they can be successful as they appropriate His presence. God isn't going to just do everything for us. He's going to accomplish His will, but He sets out a certain way of doing it. And so He very clearly gives Israel the responsibility of obeying Him, of observing Torah, as a child would observe instruction of a good parent, and also warns them as to what will happen if they do not obey. Now, in the ancient Near East, when kings made covenants with their people, they had similar stipulations. If you do what I want you to, if you remain loyal, if you pay tribute every year, if you always send men to my army when I need them, if you don't enter into covenants with other countries and undercut my authority over you, then I'll do good things for you. I'll protect you from your enemies and so forth. But if you don't, I'm going to smack you. And the king had no long-range commitment to these people beyond what they would provide for him. And so a king would come in and just destroy a people, wipe them out. But God does not set that kind of an arrangement with His people, because though He is relating to them in time around this covenant that is like a suzerain vassal treaty, yet He had committed Himself to the nation of Israel eternally through the covenant He made with Abraham. Because remember, that was a different kind of a covenant. That was a unilateral covenant. That was an unconditional covenant. And so while the ancient Near Eastern kings supported and protected the nations that were under him by treaty, they did so only so long as it benefited them. As soon as it didn't, or as soon as they rebelled, then they could expect to be punished. And that punishment was punitive, and it would sometimes, be terminal. You just wipe out a whole people. Or a people could pass over to somebody else's control if this king became weaker. But that is the difference between God's covenant with Israel, is that there was an unconditional, there was an eternality about it. And so God, first of all, had committed Himself to this people as a father to a child. Secondly, as a king to a nation. Those work hand in hand. And so you do have this same kind of arrangement, blessing for obedience, that we find in blessing and cursing, as we find in other treaties. But it is of a different nature with regard to its finality and God's long-term commitment to the people. We see in chapter 29 that there's a covenant between Yahweh and Israel, and this also is the key to their future. And you have on the top of page 61 this visual that just gives you some phrases. And I have most of this text here that I'll read. But let me just put this up, and then I'll reveal some text. Basically, what he does in chapter 29 is he renews the covenant with the second generation and reminds them that they are his unique and special people. And so we want to look at that. In verses 1 to 3, he basically says, "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb." Now remember, he's already said those covenants are one and the same, because the first generation and the second generation were both there at Horeb, and here it's distinguished because in reality it was two different sets of people. But he is reminding them that it's the same covenant. Now Moses called all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, the great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs and those great wonders." Now again, there would be some there who would have been old enough to remember it, but there would be many at Moab that would not even have been born. And so again, he's saying vicariously, you've seen this. You've seen this through the fact that you've been told about it. And so he is again connecting them with what had happened at the Exodus. He says, "But you don't see. Yet the Lord has not given you a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to understand to this very day." So it's recognized that there was still a problem with spiritual vision. There was still a problem with their heart. There was still a problem with their full understanding and compliance with what God wanted them to do. And that really is going to set them up for failure. And in Joshua, we will see that while there is success through their obedience, there are also the seeds of failure down the road. And so God knows exactly what he's getting into with this people, and he tells them where they are, and encourages them nonetheless in that. He says, "And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on your feet. Your sandals have not worn out your clothes not worn out. Your sandals have not worn out on your feet. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or similar drink, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. And when you came to this place, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against us to battle, and we conquered him." So they have seen how God has taken care of them, but they have not really fully perceived all that God would be doing for them. Continues in the next verses 9 to 13, and "Therefore keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. All of you stand today before the Lord your God, your leaders and your tribes, your elders, your officers, all the men of Israel, your little ones and your wives, and the stranger who is in your camp, that you may enter into covenant with the Lord your God and into his oath which the Lord your God makes with you today, that he may establish you today as a people for himself, and that he may be God to you, just as he has spoken to you, and just as he has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So they are to keep the words of the covenant so that they might behave like the people of the covenant. Now when he says that he might establish you today as a people for himself, this does not indicate the initiation of the relationship. There are several words used for the arrangements that God entered into with his people. When it talks about making a covenant, it uses the term karat berit. Karat is the word for cut, and it's literally to cut a covenant. And probably it could be the idea of sacrifice. The sacrifices could be the idea of cutting it into stone. But it's a particular term, and that's the term that's used for the initial entering of a covenant, used with Abraham and so forth. But here he uses a different word. And what the significance of the word is that you may come to realize the benefits and the provisions and the intent of this relationship. And so it's like when you go off to school, your parents will say, now be a Smith, or be a Jones, or and they're not telling you to become a family member. They're saying act appropriately to your upbringing. Okay, you ever been told that by your parents? All right. And this is what the word means here. So he's saying if you take up these provisions, if you will take this instruction that has been given to you, and you honor it and you keep it, then you will realize your destiny. You will become the kind of nation that God has provided for you to become, and that God wants you to become. And so that's the encouragement there in verses 9 to 13. Let's see, I think I have verses 14 and 15 here. "I make this covenant and this oath not with you alone, but with him who stands here with us today before the Lord our God, as well as with him who is not here with us today." Now, who would that be? First generation? What else could it be? So, so this is the second generation. What about the third generation, the fourth generation? Basically, he's saying, this is covenant that is being made with Israel for every generation. And so while there were covenant renewal ceremonies we have indication of later in Scripture, yet this really stands as good for all generations of Israel. So God does not start, anew with the nation of Israel throughout history. This is it. He's already into it. This is the second generation, and as the covenant is renewed with them, it's being indicated that this is a perpetual agreement as long as there is a nation Israel. So the nation of Israel is still today under these provisions, is still today under these expectations, is still today related to God by this covenant. And so we will expect to see the implications of that worked out in their experience. So there may not be among you man or woman, family, tribe, whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations. And that there may not be among you a root bearing bitterness or wormwood. And so it may not happen when he hears the words of this curse that he blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace even though I walk in the imagination of my heart. So don't let your heart be turned away. Don't play games with me. Don't just say, I'm okay, we're okay, nothing's happening right now. The key is to whether or not they're pleasing God will ultimately be what he does with them, but immediately it is whether or not they are in a heart compliance with his word. And finally, there in your notes on page 61, that the nations might not marvel at God's judgment. This is why, again, he has encouraged them to comply. This is very interesting. The Lord would not spare him, for then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book would settle on him. And the Lord would blot out his name from under heaven. And there's an individual aspect going on here, but there's also national. And the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in the book of the law. So that the coming generation of your children who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a far land, would say, when they see the plagues of the land and the sickness which the Lord has laid on it, the whole land is brimstone, salt, and burning. It is not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow there, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath. All the nations would say, why has the Lord done so to this land? So he's saying, if you disobey me and I have to bring all these curses on you, it's going to have ramifications with respect to the watching nations. I want them to see who I am, and I want them to be drawn to me. And they'll say, why has Yahweh done this to this land? What does the heat of this great anger mean? And then men would say, because they had forsaken the covenant of the Lord, God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods that they did not know and that he had not given them. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against this land to bring on it every curse that is written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, in wrath, and in great indignation, and cast them into another land, as it is this day. And so there is a testimony element here. And, that's what he's saying. I want you to act like my son nation among the nations. If I have to discipline you, other people are going to see that. And they're going to say, my goodness, what in the world could they have done to warrant this? And God is going to reveal himself even in his discipline of the nation, but that's not how he wants to manifest himself through the nation. And so we see chapter 29 being a warning and encouragement with respect to continuing and with respect to being faithful in their relationship with the Lord. My goodness. Now, there's also then restoration from captivity after repentance. We see in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 10. So yes, he threatens and he promises and he indicates that if they disobey, they will suffer the consequences of disobedience. The curses will come upon them. And remember, the ultimate of the curse is that they would actually be expelled from the land. They would actually be removed from the land. And yet, he promises that that will not be permanent, that there will be a restoration. Chapter 30, verses 1 to 3. Now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. Wonder what we're going through this for. I wonder why that is. Well, let's see. There's some obscure passage back in the book of Deuteronomy. Oh yeah, it's chapter 28. Could this be why we're sitting here instead of at home? And so there is the anticipation, and of course the reason Israel goes into this dispersion, into this captivity, is because they don't have a mindset for what's going on. So they don't realize what's going on. After the fact they will. And so God will use the experiences of Israel in a negative sense to bring repentance. And that He will still do that today. And the fact that they cannot make the connection now is because of what Paul says. There's a veil that lies on their heart, a veil of unbelief. But God will remove that veil one day, and the whole nation will come to and say, oh, this is why we're here. It says, and you will return to the Lord your God and obey His voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. And so we see here that there is the promise of restoration after captivity, and that will be when they realize that they have been in disobedience, and then they will turn. And this we're going to stop there. So we do see this dual relationship between God and His people, a relationship that has an eternal, unconditional aspect to it. God will never forsake His people. But a working relationship, a functional fellowship that indicates that He will bless them for obedience and He will curse them for disobedience. Now, the fact that Israel has undoubtedly, in the time since this, 1446, 1406 BC, until today, have experienced more of the curses than they have the blessings. And for the last nearly 2,000 years, they've been in a dispersion. They have been largely out of the land. They have been experiencing all kinds of turmoil and difficulty among the nations. And some would say, well, that indicates that God is finished with the nation of Israel. He's finished with them, that the church has replaced Israel and so forth. And they would point to things like the conditionality of this covenant to establish that. But what, again, you have to realize is that Israel's existence is not dependent upon the Mosaic covenant. Their condition is dependent upon the Mosaic covenant. Their existence is dependent upon the Abrahamic covenant. All right? And that's an unconditional covenant. So what do you do with this scenario of disobedience and expulsion from the land and so forth? Well, you've all experienced this. You've all experienced this in your own homes. Okay? Have any of you ever been, well, don't answer if it's the case. It might be a little embarrassing. I would guess that none of you have ever been dispossessed by your parents. Okay? Some of you may be adopted, and so you didn't begin a relationship with your parents in the same way as those who, live with your birth parents. But But I would dare say that none of you have ever been dispossessed by your parents. They go to the court and they say, I want to, strike a legal document to declare that this is not my child. Okay? I don't even know if you can do that. But if you could, parents don't do that. Have any of you been disciplined by your parents, though? A few of you raise your hand. The rest of you either asleep or... Sure we have. But the relationship and the fellowship are not always one and the same. Okay? Can anybody ever think of a special gift that you were given, a possession that you had, that your enjoyment of it, your use of it, was conditioned upon how you used it or how you behaved in general? Anybody ever had anything like that? A BB gun? Pellet gun, a car. Okay, anybody ever been given a BB gun or a pellet gun? They still do that now. That was a favorite thing. Okay, how many of you lost that at some point? Why? Vince?
Shot out a car window as it drove down the road.
Oh, shot out. That's a bad one. Out a car window as it was driving down the road. We have a bad boy here. Yeah, he was impressed. Okay. So, and your parents found out about it? How old were you? 10. Okay, pretty good shot for a 10-year-old, 50 miles an hour. And your parents found out about it. They took the gun away from you, did they? Did you ever get it back?
Yeah, a month later.
A month later. All right, a month later. Okay. Was the gun still yours after it had been taken away?
Yes.
It was still his gun. But he forfeited for a month the use of it for improper use. All right? Now that is exactly the illustration. That is exactly the situation we find with Israel and the land. The land is theirs by title. It's theirs by eternal covenant, God's covenant with Abraham. That's what establishes their ownership of the land. But their actual enjoyment of the land, their temporal possession of the land, is conditioned upon obedience. And so God has never revoked their right to the land. But we see in Deuteronomy, he very clearly sets conditions for their enjoyment and their blessedness in the land. And all of their fortune, all of their life is tied to the land. That's how God set it up. And he set it up that way because this is how a nation can be seen to be blessed by God. And so their fortune is tied to the land. But there is a difference between their ownership, their title deed, their absolute right to the land, and their temporal, that is, their enjoyment of it, their possession of it, their blessing in it at any given time, at any given generation. And God set that up so that he could work in the nations, and that whole relationship to the land is still being worked out. So Deuteronomy 28 and 30 are extremely important in that regard. Now, sometimes you will hear Deuteronomy 30 taught as a Palestinian covenant, as another unconditional covenant. And I used to teach that years and years and 30 and 40 years ago. But I don't really think that there is a separate covenant here. The issue of the land and the title of the land is all set forth in the Abrahamic covenant. Well, what Deuteronomy is doing is just showing the modus operandi of their relationship to the land, how it is that they will actually enjoy it. And as you were raised by your parents, your parents gave you various kinds of responsibilities, various kinds of commands, various kinds of expectations. And there were various consequences or benefits associated with those expectations, were there not? It could have been allowance, it could have been privileges, it could have been grounding for this, It could have been going to a special place for this. And that's just the nature of life. That, parents and children have a relationship that is not at all conditioned upon the fellowship they may be enjoying at any one point. You are your parent's child. And that's never going to change. But you also are in a daily fellowship arrangement with your parents. We use the word relationship in both senses, don't we? Fellowship and relations, okay? Kinship. So, that's exactly what Israel is doing here with the nation. They are His because He has created them through His promise to Abraham. They are the seed of Abraham. And they were already related to God as His son before He entered into this covenant, weren't they? Exodus 4. Tell Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my son go that he may serve me. And when they get to Mount Sinai, He gives them the covenant, and that's how they're going to serve Him. And so that isn't where they become related to God. That's where the nationship arrangement is formulated. And so, it's just like us. When we are born to our parents, that's the establishment of the relationship. That can't change. But my fellowship with my parents changes, doesn't it? Sometimes from day to day, hour to hour. With my son, it could be minute to minute. He was just a good time looking for a place to happen. And and a lot of his good times didn't really suit, what we wanted him to be doing when he was, this big. Now he's just the most. He's not like that now. A very responsible individual. But at times, Mrs. Van Dyne felt like disowning him. I'm sure, By 10 o'clock in the morning, he could just have her in tears, and I'm sorry, Bobby, I won't do it again. Yeah. That lasted about 30 seconds, and off he goes again. But that's parent-child relationships. And some children just have more difficulty complying than other children. You ever notice that? You may be one of those. If you aren't, and you have a sibling, one of them probably was. There seems to always be at least one in every family. And it's a mystery. It's a mystery. Parents doing the same thing, and they got 3 kids that are just wonderful, and they got one kid that just, going the other direction. And that's God with Israel. And so it's, it really is the way life works. It's just that here it's on a corporate level as a nation and their God. And so if you just get that in mind, the Abrahamic covenant is what is the basis of the relationship. It is the Mosaic covenant, as is most fully formulated in Deuteronomy, that is the key to their fellowship and therefore their well-being and their benefits upon the earth. Okay, well, let's see. We got to finish this up. In chapter 30, later verses 11 to 20, he tells them to choose life or death by loving the Lord their God. Again, it's a heart thing. For this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It's not in the heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea and for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. And why is that? Because God was there, and He'd give it to them. He'd given it to them in forms that it was possible for them to think about it, and He was there. See, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil, and that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments, His statutes, His judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. So it's clear what his intention is for the nation of Israel, to choose life. Now, we find interestingly enough in chapter 30 a song of covenant unfaithfulness. Well, this is great. You start out with the nation, and that's actually chapter 32. That should say chapter 32. How can that stay in there like that so long? You've got a song of covenant unfaithfulness, and it's interesting that God says this great thing, and then He says, "But here's I know you're going to disobey." Now, parents sometimes say that to their children, out of frustration, maybe. You always wonder if that's the best strategy. But here, this is what God is saying, and so we do see that there is a reality about God's understanding with them. Now, one other thing I want to cover, the need for a king and prophet. The need for a king and prophet. And we see here that in chapter 17 and 18, he envisions there going to be a different structure. They've had Moses with them. Moses has been the mediator. Moses has been virtually God standing in their presence. And God has revealed himself through Moses. But Moses is going to leave. And Joshua doesn't become Moses. Joshua takes over and leading them militarily into the land. But Joshua doesn't become Moses. It's the priesthood that is to teach them. God is their king. But God does foresee that there will be a king, and he says that the king must be certain things. First of all, the king must be the Lord's choice. They must not choose their own king, but they must take the king that he gives to them. Secondly, the king must be an Israelite, and so they were not to ever have a foreign king over them. And it says the king was not to multiply three things. Very interesting things. You remember what they were? Horses, wives, and money. Now, what in the world do those three have in common? Now, men, be careful before you answer that. As Mr. Glock says, your potential mate might be sitting next to you, or might not be, depending on how you would answer this question. Whoa. What do horses and wives and money have in common? They all cause trouble. That's from our married class member. I didn't say that. He did. And I won't give his name on tape because, maybe he'll get back to his wife. Well, the way kings... One of the devices that kings had for solidifying their nation had to do with all these areas. Horses, military strength. Horses, chariots.
Al has trouble in plural.
Oh, in plural. Okay. I don't know if that'll get you out of it. Horses, military strength. The greater the army you had, the better able you were to secure your kingdom against the threat from other kingdoms. And horses were critical to that. Money as well was critical to that. So the more money you had, the better able you were to solidify your kingdom. And in the ancient Near East, wives also were a key to the stability of a kingdom in terms of outside threat, because most often kings multiplied wives for the purpose of political alliance. And you remember who Solomon's first wife is named as far as where she was from? Who was she? Pharaoh's daughter. And so, if you are married to Pharaoh's daughter and Egypt is the world power, you have a protection there, And so these three things really were what ancient kings looked to for the security of their kingdom. And God is saying that my kings are not to look to these things. Who are they to look to? Me, God says. I will be the guarantor of your safety. And so these aren't just arbitrary, and so we see that. The other thing that the king was to do was to copy the Torah and read it all the days of his life. Isn't that interesting? This king was to be a king who ruled by what God had communicated in terms of his character and his designs and what his people were to be in the world. Now, I don't know how many kings did this. Most of them didn't, I'm sure. But this is an interesting standard. And so we see here the divine viewpoint with regard to the kind of a king Israel would have when they were to have a king. Do you have a question?
Yeah. How did David and Solomon get away with that without ever?
They didn't. They suffered for it, and the nation suffered for it. So they violated this, and in the violation of it, there were problems that arose in the nation. So, and that just points out that God does not work his purposes because or through our perfect obedience. He eventually accomplishes his will through our questionable obedience, sometimes through our disobedience. And so we do see when this is violated. Just because they did it didn't mean God approved of it. And Solomon eventually lost his faith over it. He was led away into the worship of false gods through the multiplying of foreign wives. And the scriptures make that really clear.